Hello and welcome to the Satluj TV podcast. Now, in recent days, we've been talking about the updated Sikh Manifesto to coincide with upcoming elections here in the UK. Well, I'm delighted to say our returning guest is a co-author of that very document. And in today's discussion, we're going to be focusing on a few key elements of that manifesto. So my guest, for those who haven't seen our earlier discussion, is Principal Advisor of the Sikh Federation UK and founding member of the Sikh network that produced the acclaimed Sikh Manifesto. He's also a highly accomplished civil servant who was honoured by Her Majesty the Queen herself, receiving an OBE. He's also freshly back from addressing huge crowds in Trafalgar Square, London, where the 1984 commemoration rally gathered at the weekend in vast numbers. Dabinderjit Singh, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Nice to be on your show again, Angus.
Now, the Sikh Manifesto, it's a powerful document. It covers several big areas, but today we're going to focus on the very final one, that's section 10, application of self-determination of the Sikhs. Now, Dabinderjit, to me, self-determination, it's a democratic given right, something that we here in the UK certainly take for granted. We've had it in Scotland, for example. Now, the manifesto obviously details the historical context of justifying the existence of Khalistan, but what I find equally interesting is it talks much about the legal justification under international law. Perhaps you could please elaborate more about that specific aspect.
Like you said, Angus, I guess the starting point is, even if you talked before about Sikhs, is the right to self-determination is a basic human right. And every respected government in the world respects that right. It's there in the UN Charter. And so that's the starting point, that every single person has that right, and every single group of people have that right. And actually, when India came to sign up to the right to self-determination back in 1966, if I'm not mistaken, they put in a reservation. And in short, what that means is they said, we believe in the right to self-determination, but not for the people that live in India. So I don't know whether they were thinking about Sikhs, Kashmiris, you name it, because India is a whole hodgepodge of states, languages, people with quite different lifestyles. And interestingly enough, Germany, the Netherlands, and France and Pakistan raised objections to that, saying you can't allow India to put in this reservation. And that's come up every so often at the UN Human Rights Council, saying India has still not removed that reservation. And that's important because I want to come back to it. So firstly, India is denying the right to self-determination, which is a basic human right, to everyone in India, not just the Sikhs. And the argument that India would say is territorial integrity. And this is an argument that's put up again and again by nations. Now, your listeners will be well aware what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. So in today's world, if a nation goes into another nation and tries to take it by force, that's deemed an illegal act under international law. So actually, now history does come into play, and it's particularly important as far as Britain is concerned. So we go back to 1849. So this is when the Sikh kingdom, which existed for 50 years, under Maharaja Ranjit Singh, came to an end. And actually, the word that's constantly used, but we bring it out in this section 10 of the manifesto, is Britain, or the East India Company, annexed the Sikh kingdom. An annexation would, in today's language, be regarded as an illegal act under international law. So firstly, the British government, irrespective of whether it's Conservative today and it might be Labour in a few weeks' time, they can't ignore history. They can't ignore this direct association with, the First Anglo-Sikh War, the Second Anglo-Sikh War, yes, there were Anglo-Sikh treaties, but there was no treaty because they themselves, it was said it was an annexation of the Sikh kingdom. Now, this then almost follows on. For the next 100 years, Sikhs became almost the backbone of the British, and let's call it Indian Army, even though India didn't exist in 1947. It became the backbone, and it first came up in 1857 when we had the Indian Mutiny. And anyone that reads about the Indian Mutiny will know that it was the Sikh soldiers that stood by with the British. And that was the first thing that Britain learned, is Sikhs are loyal soldiers. They learned it through the Anglo-Sikh Wars. They studied Sikhs. They knew what makes them tick in terms of their religious scriptures, their identity, and they promoted it. And they promoted it like no end. The other one that often is talked about came in 1897, or the Battle of Sargri in what's now Afghanistan, where a small group of Sikh soldiers died to the last man. And it's regarded as one of the well-known battles in world history. But then there's the First World War, the Second World War, and we all know about that. The turban-wearing Sikhs sacrificed their lives, effectively fighting for Britain in Europe and around the globe. And the reason why we say that is, if Britain illegally annexed the Sikh kingdom in 1849, for almost the next 100 years, Britain took full advantage of that loyalty of Sikhs to Britain, irrespective of Jallianwala Bagh happening within 6 months of the end of the First World War, the birthplace of Guru Nanak, that we just marked the 100th anniversary in 2021, what happened there, the massacre. And the other thing was, Sikhs just played a massive part in the Indian independence movement, effectively against Britain. And that was why, if we fast forward then to 1947, why was it that Britain always discussed things with three parties? They effectively had the Indian Congress, which effectively represented, what became India. They had the Muslim League, which effectively became Pakistan. But the third party that was always around the table were the Sikhs. And I would put it that, and this has never really been brought out, particularly in mainstream media, it's because of the history. It's the history that they'd annexed the Sikh kingdom, and therefore, realistically speaking, they should have returned it to the Sikhs. And where we bring out in section 10 is, if you roll the clock back to 1849, the Sikh kingdom, in terms of its size, was twice the size of the United Kingdom. So it wasn't a small country. It also had a population that was the 12th highest in the world. I think from memory, I haven't got the manifesto in front of me, I think it was 12 million. The population of the UK was 10 million. The US was 5 million, because back in 1849, I think Australia was almost negligent and Canada was almost negligent. It was in the thousands. It was one of the most populous countries, and yet the Sikh population in the Sikh kingdom was probably around 10%. So in other words, even though you had a Sikh kingdom that existed for 50 years, and so even this day and age, they say, if you looked at the Sikh population and where they are they becoming a minority in the India part of Punjab? It's irrelevant, because this is about running a country on the basis of the principles of the Sikh faith, which is, religious freedoms for all, the well-being of all. And that was demonstrated in that 50 years of reign, where no one was put to death. And actually people said it was probably the people that lived in that Sikh kingdom generally prospered. And so some of that history is really important, but the British connection, so in a Sikh manifesto going into a general election, that British connection has been brought out more in this particular manifesto, because partly what's happened I would say, not even in the last 12 months. Well, let's say 12 months, because we're recording this program on the 18th of June, so it's exactly a year since Deep Singh Nijjar was obviously assassinated, is since Justin Trudeau spoke on the 18th of September, 3 months later, so many people asking, what is this thing called Khalistan? Because India's demonized that word over probably the last 40 years. But actually, the word itself, there's nothing wrong with it. It says the land of the Khalsa. And the Khalsa is just the pure Sikhs, the 10th Guru. And therefore, it's not a negative phrase and should never be seen as a negative phrase. But politically, it's been demonized with governments across the globe. But I think what we've been seeing is more and more people are saying, well, what is this thing called Khalistan? Is it a bad thing? What is the history of the Sikhs? And I think we've got so many things in our favour that actually there does need to be a public debate, particularly in the UK, about what is wrong with the Sikhs having a homeland. What's wrong given their history? What's wrong given their principles? And actually, maybe if there was a Sikh kingdom, particularly Western nations might find actually would be loyal allies. But also, Sikhs are known for hard work wherever they've gone across the globe. And I think this whole thing of India's policy, and I think particularly under Narendra Modi of the last decade, is we've seen it unravelling since the transnational repression issue came out. So although Section 10 stands alone around the right to self-determination, there's lots of other things in some of the other sections that, when you take it as a whole, I had one person, she read the manifesto in Section 10 and said, I just can't see how anyone would argue against this. And the bit I'm not mentioning, because I might as well throw it in now before you raise another question, is this argument India puts up about territorial integrity. The argument of territorial integrity is a valid one that any existing nation could use, that no other nation, no other group of people could question our territorial integrity, our borders. However, there's one big caveat, which is you don't abuse the human rights of those people that live within your borders. And we can start in 1947 and come right the way up to 2024 or 1984, which is about halfway through, is Sikhs. We talk about our genocide. We talk about transnational repression. What more evidence does the international community need to say India's argument for territorial integrity just doesn't hold? Because people's human rights aren't respected. And therefore, we think more and more there are governments, probably starting with the US, and I think the former President Obama, said this probably no longer than 12 months ago, that if India does not respect religious freedoms, he could see the breakup of India happening. And I think that is a lot closer now than it was 12 months ago.
Yeah, I think you've hit a really rich seam of argument there and justification, because India's justification legally has been it would threaten their territorial integrity. And as you rightly say, the only defence against that is if a nation respects all its inhabitants equally across any land that is trying to argue for self-determination. And there is a long history dating back not just decades, but longer than that, where clearly there has been oppression and clearly there is a divide culturally, regionally, in fact on every level there is a divide between, let's call it the core of India and this region in the northwest, the region of Punjab. So all the elements all these dominoes seem to be putting into place quite neatly actually, and the arguments are becoming more and more mainstream. We are hearing more and more mainstream media talking about it. Even governments are talking about it now. What do you think are the next steps? I mean, it's now entered a public discourse. What do you think can be done next to take this to the next step? We've got the referendum being rolled out, but what can happen practically, do you think, to start this ball rolling towards independence?
So, Angus, I think one of the things we say, because the narrative in the Sikh Manifesto, particularly in front, is Sikhs are at a political crossroads. We're going to see elections in America, we're going to see elections in Canada, we're going to see elections in the UK in a few weeks, and we've just had elections in India. And therefore, politics, because I think in any sort of nation-building concept, the idea of nations, other nations they always get involved to some degree. And I think because the Sikh Manifesto is very much focused on the UK government, and it's probably almost a given that there will be a change of government in the UK after 14 years of Conservatives, our starting point, and as you've probably seen in the last few days, we've been talking not in our media, but in mainstream media about our expectations of a UK government. It could be Labour now, it could be Conservative, it could be some other party in the future. Their first priority should be to its citizens, the people living, on this island, basically, and Northern Ireland, if you add in Northern Ireland, and the interests of foreign governments should be secondary. Now, that's the ideal world. Now, we know that's not how things work. But when it comes to Britain and India, there is the big elephant in the room that since 1947, India has systematically, without fail, ensured that we'll never have a Justin Trudeau event in the UK. We will never have Joe Biden sending the CIA director and telling Modi at the G20 summit that what India's doing is not right. In the UK, we virtually get no public criticism of what happens in India from the UK government, and it's Conservatives today, and that is our fear, that an incoming, say, Labour government will be the British establishment will be advising them, and probably have been advising them for a good year, because I know how politics works and shadow ministers meet various people, to say India is so important to Britain, a future trade agreement. And actually, the 136-page Labour manifesto does talk about India. It doesn't talk about Sikhs. And it's so interestingly, we need to be very mindful that an incoming Labour government, whilst we think we stand a better opportunity because there could be up to 14 Sikh Labour MPs and there may be even some ministers, there will be the ability to influence on the inside, a bit like with Justin Trudeau or actually any of the political parties in Canada. The deputy leader of the Conservatives is a Sikh, Tim Uppal, that actually it could be that if we have a Labour government and a Labour government for 10 years, that decade, our key ask would be of any UK government to be genuine to Sikhs and what Sikhs do in this country. Don't demonise us. Take full advantage of what Sikhs have to offer. And I think we can win the hearts and minds of the public. I think we already have. It doesn't matter where we are in the globe. People generally respect the Sikhs for what they are. And I often, and I've spoken in events and I've spoken to ambassadors. I remember speaking in the European Parliament, and I think I was talking about the contribution of Sikhs in the world wars. And there were a number of ambassadors from African countries. And afterwards they said, so how many countries do the Sikhs run? Because at that time it was Manmohan Singh who's the Prime Minister of India. And they just thought, oh, Sikhs, it must be, fifth largest faith. They must be running loads of countries. And I said, no, we haven't got a single country. We haven't got a homeland. And I think they were shocked because they thought everything that Sikhs do and everything they represent, we definitely punch above, our numbers. And I think, therefore, we're on a journey now where probably half the politicians that will be elected on the 4th of July in the UK will be new MPs. So the manifesto serves many purposes, and one purpose is to educate politicians, because I think more and more politicians, and just like members of the public, they question what Britain might have done in the past. They question about what Britain should be doing in the future. And I think if we can win the hearts and minds using the media, mainstream media of the British public, then I think, I was told many years ago of the triangle. The triangle is politicians, the media and the public, and they all interplay. So the media plays a massive role in influencing the public, and politicians are clearly mindful of the public because they're the ones that vote them in and out. And I think Sikhs, particularly in the diaspora, are very much stronger 40 years after 1984. And I think this is the real interesting part, and I'm sort of going to go into one or two other parts of the manifesto that are related, is if someone said transnational oppression in the last 12 months, lots of things that are coming out, lots of things you read, they're basically saying that Narendra Modi really took serious note of the Sikh diaspora when it came to the farmers' protest, because that was the one challenge to him that was multi-faith, multi-state, and it created him lots of problems. Some are even suggesting the election results probably, basically it's a bit like Theresa May calling election in 2017 thinking I'm going to expand my majority, you end up going backwards, is it could well be the impact of the farmers that are still protesting is they are very resourceful. And it just happens that Sikh farmers are very visible and people from Punjab. So in a sense, we've got lots of intel about this and lots of things that have been written saying Narendra Modi and his national security advisor thought the Sikh diaspora is a real pain in the backside, and they've gone and done things which clearly the US, Canada, Australia, Britain, they don't want India to be, doing things on their soil. And actually the way the Indian government has played this since, I would say last June, has meant that Canada has almost drawn a line, in terms of what they're saying, political interference they're talking about now, politicians being offered favours, money, and apparently there's police investigations. Well, I think that could be true of the UK. It's definitely true probably of the US. And I think when countries start saying under Narendra Modi, they are doing things that either we have to call them out and they'll stop, or they will then have alternative strategies. And one of those strategies will be actually India's getting too big for its boots, or the Indian government. It's not the people of India. And I think I'm actually certain there are strategists probably sitting in the US that are saying, right, what's the alternative model? Break up of India, a very strong and powerful Sikh homeland, and people we can, realise from the Sikhs that live in this country or live in the West or wherever they've gone in the globe, they are genuine people that are very tolerant and actually trusted, hardworking, and actually that's the big question, that Narendra Modi is really no longer trusted. He probably wasn't trusted 10 years ago, but they've had to deal with him, and they will still carry on dealing with him. But I suspect that the politics in India is one to watch, but also the politics of Western nations, because I think it could well be, we could be sitting here in 12 months' time, that I genuinely think the concept and idea of a Sikh homeland, or the re-establishment of a Sikh homeland, we use this language that it's not new, historically we've had this, is actually probably seen as a positive, probably by governments, but it's just how you get from where you are now to where you want to be, and really people need to watch the space in the next 12 months.
This is interesting, Dabinderjit, because you've raised a lot of very important points there, but what struck me clearly, Narendra Modi is significantly weaker now in his third term. And this actually has potentially changed the dynamic to quite a large degree between India and the rest of the world, but particularly with the UK. Now, we could argue that here in the UK, we've been, I would say, a slightly weak party in our negotiations with India, primarily because, as we referred to, we want a trade deal with this enormous nation, this enormous market. We have a really long, deep, varied history. That's a simple term to describe our history with India, but certainly an interesting history with India. And clearly there are very strong links between the British establishment and the Indian establishment. I wonder then, particularly here in the UK, if there is a bit of a quid pro quo situation potentially developing here, where I understand that Sir Keir Starmer has given a promise, certainly an undertaking, to launch an inquiry into the events of 1984. Now that inquiry, if it is genuine, if it is legitimate, and if the parameters of that inquiry are wide enough to include scope that will uncover actually what genuinely happened, not just in 1984, but the years leading up to that, because clearly there is a lot more that went on that the public don't know about. If he's given this undertaking, it will hugely embarrass the British establishment. So the quid pro quo then could be, maybe the British establishment could be persuaded, okay, we will agree as a community to allow the parameters to be closed sufficiently that the embarrassing elements are kept out, but in return, we want the British establishment to support the establishment of a Sikh nation, Khalistan, because obviously it offers the UK and it offers the Western democracies a huge staging point, a beachhead, shall we say, in that region. So strategically, as you referred to, it matches all sorts of positive tick boxes that we need in that region to buttress China. But it also solves so many of these open wounds. 1984, the betrayal, the British betrayal of the Sikhs going back 200 plus years. So do you think actually this could be a unique moment in time, a unique opportunity for the community to really push the British establishment, essentially to change their strategic direction and promote Khalistan?
And I think that is the big question that, come the 4th of July, come the 5th of July, probably we'll see a change of government. Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. And let's stick to that one promise. So in the last two Labour manifestos, they've said that there will be, and I'll be very careful with my language, but then I'll expand on this. They have promised an independent inquiry. And now I've deliberately left out judge and I've deliberately left out public because most people's understanding of an independent inquiry is it has to be judge-led. So in our language, we're very clear it has to be a judge-led inquiry. And the reason for that is only, say, a High Court judge or a retired High Court judge will be able to see all the evidence that will be necessary because we are talking about the SAS. So when we get into that debate, and that debate, in fact, I was digging out things for a journalist who's potentially writing something for one of the national papers on this, that they were saying, right, when did you meet David Lammy face-to-face? When did you meet Yvette Cooper face-to-face? What written exchanges have we had? Because it's not what's been in the previous manifestos. It's the fact that when Angela Rayner tweeted on the 1st of June this year about that inquiry, I was telling people it's not going to be in the 136-page Labour manifesto, which was actually drafted by a Sikh as well, coincidentally. It was never going to be there because Keir Starmer is all about securing a Labour government and coming into power, and he is not going to put these things into the manifesto. However, he can't ignore what's been in previous manifestos because this isn't something with a big pound sign on it. This isn't going to cost billions. So one of the things that we have said to David Lammy, face-to-face and in writing, and it's mentioned in the manifesto, is it would be good, once we get a Labour government, for that judge-led independent public inquiry to start within 100 days of a Labour government, and to reflect the fact that this was conversation happening for at least 2 years. I think I want to check, it was April 22. I remember meeting David Lammy, and then June 2022 meeting Yvette Cooper, because it'll actually be the Home Secretary that announces the public inquiry. Is we've sort of said in the manifesto, recognising the first 100 days will be probably largely spent, most politicians being on holiday and then party conferences, is what we've said is we expect a public inquiry to start in this 40th anniversary year. So I think the yesterday's event in London, the national media coverage that's been there, I think there will be more coming out. I think we will hold the Labour government, Keir Starmer, David Lammy, Yvette Cooper, whoever are in those positions in government, to say there will always be elections in the future, and Sikhs have a memory and they don't forget. And I think we have public opinion on our side as well. So I think, and there'll be a role of whoever's in opposition to raise their voices as well. So I think it's a realistic ask, as you said, that a Labour government will start a public inquiry with the appointment of a judge. Now it goes on to your second point. The first thing a judge will do is have to decide on terms of reference. What is the period that judge is going to look at? And there will be consultation. And clearly what David Cameron did 10 years ago, he told his cabinet secretary to look at a very narrow period. And that was deliberate. And I remember it like it was yesterday, 28th of January 2014, Sir Jeremy Hayward calls a meeting, and I was there, whole group of Sikhs, and they said we take 2 people to represent our organisation, and we decided to take somebody called Parmjit Singh Gill, who was a former Liberal Democrat MP from Leicester. Because remember, it was coalition government, so Nick Clegg was Deputy Prime Minister. And Parmjit asked the killer question that nobody had bothered asking. They'd already written the report. It was going to be in Parliament the next week. He said, have you shared your terms of reference? And have you been talking to Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister? And you could see the look on his face. And we were sent the next day, part of his terms of reference. I looked at the period December 1983 to June 1984. And that's why we were on television, on Sky News, 2 or 3 hours before the report was presented, saying it's a whitewash, it's a cover-up, because people knew about what was happening in November 83 around the Westlands helicopter deal. And therefore, he'd deliberately been told to pick a period where the juicy information might not necessarily emerge. And therefore, that is going to be the thing. Appointment of a judge, getting the terms of reference right. And there are 2 parts to this inquiry, which I think is a really important thing that lots of politicians need to understand. The initial view was that the inquiry should look at UK involvement. Why did Margaret Thatcher's government do what they did? What was the logic? Because they tried to make it was a secret. No one was supposed to ever know about this. She was being advised it would be a bloodbath. And therefore, it's a really almost indefensible thing to do. I thought it was in April 2024, David Cameron in the House of Lords, when Operation Blue Star was talked about, he actually said it was wrong. Now, if he calls the attack on the Golden Temple complex as wrong, it doesn't take a genius to work out, therefore, any advice the UK government at the time gave must have also been wrong. And therefore, there's no getting away from this, that Britain and the British government at the time did things that they never wanted the public to know about. Forget the Sikh community, but the public, British public, have a right to know what their government's doing in their name. But then we've done further research as the papers are coming out. So based on about 50% of the government's papers we published in November 2017 a report called Sacrificing Sikhs, which Phil Miller led on. And it basically said, based upon the government's papers, we can tell you all these things, like the British High Commissioner saying in April 1983 to Margaret Thatcher, the Indian government shouldn't use force to enter the Golden Temple, there'd be a bloodbath. And therefore, why did she then, in February 1984, send an SAS officer to, what was he there to do? To advise the Indian military about how to carry out the attack on the Sikhs' holiest of holy places? And I think when that starts to unravel, the second aspect of this is about what did the UK government do at that time to try and silence the voice of opposition of Sikhs in this country. So on the one hand, India was doing what it was doing in terms of June 1984 and afterwards. And this is, I think, where there's going to be a debate, because we've talked to lots of Labour MPs that said that is equally important, if not more important, because advising a foreign government about something that clearly we can now look back and said was wrong, well, unfortunately, governments do this around the globe all the time. But then to try and silence the British Sikh voice here, to stopping protests, leaning on the BBC, we brought all these things out in that report. And we said this is based upon 50% of the papers. And I'll share one bit of, one sort of glimmer of where I think the challenge is going to come. The current permanent secretary at the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office was giving evidence in the tribunal that I attended with Phil Miller, a 3-day tribunal in London over the release of Cabinet Office papers. He was, at that time, not the permanent secretary, but he was there, and I remember him saying to the judge the day he turned up on the first day, I must go because I need to see the Prime Minister this afternoon, who is Theresa May, because of the attack in Salisbury. And I remember the judge saying to him, you can go and see the Prime Minister, but I want you to come back. And one of the things that there were 2 people giving evidence, he was one of them from the Foreign Office, and I think it was the other person whose name I don't recollect. He said one thing. He said, if the papers came out now, and I think this is 2018, so all these years after 1984, they feared what it would do to, 1, relations with India, 2, what might happen in this country. And I've wrecked my brain. What did Britain advise back in 1984? What is on those files we've not seen that they're worried about what people in this country will think? And to be fair to the 3-member tribunal, 2 layperson, that judge, when they gave their judgment against the Cabinet Office, they said there's a high public interest that these things, they criticised David Cameron's Hayward review, saying it's too narrow, lacked scope. So they considered all this. They considered the Sacrificing Sikhs report. So I think we are quite confident that if we get a judge-led inquiry where the terms of reference are wide enough, then I think in the world of politics, all sorts of things, and I won't go down the line you did because, it's the first step. I think there should be strategists and governments around the globe, probably led by the US, thinking of, in the world of sort of geopolitics, there is a better solution to what we currently have. And I would argue strongly, I think that new world has a powerful Sikh homeland where actually all the good that Sikhs have done ever since they came into existence and what our teachings are, that actually the world would be a better place. And actually the Indian subcontinent might be a bit more stable and peaceful, and people might be talking a bit more about what we pray daily for, which is the well-being of all.
Yeah, just going back to the public inquiry element here. I mean, never in the history of public inquiries in this country has a public inquiry ever held against the establishment. It's a known fact because it's the defendant is also judge and jury in these cases. And they use all these mechanisms, one of which is, of course, setting the terms of reference of any inquiry. And they are set in advance. in full knowledge of what they're trying to hide. So, of course, those terms of reference are narrowed sufficiently to avoid the elements that they obviously do not want to reveal. But what I do believe is that the establishment always will prefer to take a path of least resistance. And it's very clear the Sikh community has been a constant thorn in the side of both the Indian establishment and the British establishment. The evidence, it just goes back decades. Surely the whole concept of Khalistan is just the simplest solution to getting rid of this thorn in the side. It solves so many issues. Firstly, it removes all the negative problems that both establishments have, both in India and here in the UK, and it immediately brings on side 1 million plus potential Sikhs here in the UK. But then, of course, there's the whole positive aspect. We talk about the regional strategic benefits of having Khalistan in existence. It's to me, whichever angle you look at it, the Sikhs, their constant lobbying, their constant provocative poking at these establishments, it must be perennially, perpetually irritating for these establishments. I don't understand why they do not move.
And I think India's played its cards of, Britain as a colonial power and what they did in India, and we can't change history, whether we talk about, the massacre in 1919, etc. But I just think, 1947 was a long time ago. The politicians that are in power can't necessarily be held to account for what their predecessors have done. And actually, you need strength, you need courage, you need to see what is better and look to the future. And I think our biggest asset for a Sikh homeland actually is Narendra Modi and the BJP and what they've done. Because I think deep down, politicians around the globe, governments around the globe, agencies, and this is an instrument, agencies around the globe. So we can have a different president in the US, we can have a different prime minister in Canada, in the UK. But the intelligence agencies have firmly established in their minds that they cannot be trusted as long as Narendra Modi and Ajit Doval are running the country. And whilst they've had a step back, he is now entering a third term. He may have domestic challenges to implementing certain policies. But if they don't see a change of heart, if they don't see a change of direction, then I think we're a lot closer to them looking at an alternative model for the Indian subcontinent. And I think Sikhs just need to be doing more of what they've been doing. At the one level, we can say, public pressure, which is what we do and we're good at, or it can be people on the inside. And I think across the globe, Sikhs are a lot more well established. You're talking about third, fourth generation Sikhs here. I was born in the UK. I could have a debate with any UK politician about the idea of self-determination for the Sikhs in Khalistan. And I have no doubt I could win that argument. And it reminds me of when we first produced the manifesto in 2015. I won't name the politician, but he sat in the meeting and he said, I can agree with sections 1 to 9. Section 10 back then was self-determination. So he said, all right, let's have a debate. And as he left, he said, all right, you got me at 9.5. He's a professor as well. He's not stupid. Because he said, yeah, your right to self-determination exists. Your history since 1947 we can't deny. You've tried to go for greater autonomy, which is the first stage of self-determination, but India's denied that. So external self-determination, i.e. your independence, is there. He said, the only reason why I say 9.5, because as a British politician, I can't really be publicly saying I support the right to seek independence in Khalistan. I think that was 10 years ago, 2015. Now we're in a different world because given India's own actions and what they've been doing in your countries, you have every right to talk about what India's been doing. And this is the fascinating thing. The US authorities have increasingly publicly started to criticize India and its human rights record. However, if you look at the human rights report by our Foreign Office, India gets no mention. And it's a massive report. And that is not being truthful and honest, because even politicians stand up in Parliament and they talk about, what's been happening to different minorities, whether it be Christians in India, whether it be some of the laws that have been passed. And it's almost like we're doing a disservice to basically people that live here, people, the public. If you're not calling out India.
Yeah, I mean, this sits really strangely with this cultural shift that we've had in this country and across the West. This high degree of introspection now, where we're looking back on our history, on our past, particularly the colonial past, and we're talking about reparations for slavery. We're going all those years back, and culturally there is this huge movement now to make these reparations, to have this collective guilt about what we've done in the past. And we're doing this across every other ethnic minority, every other colonial sin that we as a nation, as an empire committed, except for this one little element, this one niche area, the Sikhs. Why? What is it? Why are we not addressing this one thing? Why are we not raising this and demanding as a culture? We say, yes, we owe the Sikhs a huge debt. We betrayed them constantly over a very long period of time. We talked about annexation at the beginning of the discussion. Why are we not looking at the Sikhs? Why are we looking at them in separate and treating them very differently? To me, that implies there's an awful lot to hide. We've buried an awful lot of information we don't want revealing. Is there an element, or is there an opportunity here? Again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, because clearly we're not talking about the Sikh issue in terms of reparations and collective guilt. Maybe there is this quid pro quo saying, OK, we'll accept being treated differently, but in return, we want our Khalistan.
And I think that's the big question is, will those conversations go on with the new UK government? All I would say is to date, our experience has been India's played those cards. They almost say, Sikhs are part of India. Sikhs almost exist. When you say this, in the Indian constitution, Sikhs have never signed up to it because they regard us as Hindus with basically long hair. And therefore, they even try and change our faith and what our gurus did, and they were defenders of India and things like that, which is actually misrepresenting what we are. The British fully understand. They've studied the Sikhs. That's what they did after the Anglo-Sikh Wars. They wrote about it, and they wrote about also the risks. And I think one of the things I often talk to particularly youngsters about is when the top scholars of Britain studied the Sikhs, what makes them so good soldiers? Why did they put up such a battle with Britain? They came to the conclusion there were two things, their scriptures and their identity. And we've not been able to share that rich teachings in our scriptures, which not only come from the gurus, but, philosophers, poets, saints of other faiths. And very few people, when they study the scriptures, find that, they are scriptures that could be here to eternity. And that's why we regard them as the living guru. And I think that was the one thing Britain did, and some of those scholars, was actually say, if the world ever got to know about the Sikhs and what they stand for, that they could be they could monopolise sort of the world type thing. It was that sort of thing. So British, very cleverly, the way they managed Sikhs and pressed certain buttons and took advantage. And I think people like me just say, look, I'm British. This is my country as much as it is Rishi Sunak's or Keir Starmer's. And therefore, what I want of my government is something entirely different to what they think I might want, because they're trying to appease India. And I think that is the real issue, is I don't think yet we've come to that point where British politicians say, we want to be on the right side of history. And the right side of history is with the Sikhs and standing with them, because they have done everything for us. And they have never, you respect your opponent. So if we sacrifice the most lives in terms of Sikh independence, going to the gallows, being sent to prison, that is never held against the Sikhs. It's actually just saying, here are freedom-loving people that will come to the fore, irrespective of their numbers. And I think we can, and I'll go back to that, I think we can win the hearts and minds of the public. I think we can win the hearts and minds of politicians, because what we want the government and the establishment, though, to do is to go over that hill. They're sort of climbing up the hill. They're almost to the top. But when they start coming downhill, I think that's all about a Sikh homeland existing as a positive thing for countries across the globe. And I think the key to this actually is the US. You know, Britain's not the power it was. And I remember this, and this goes back 15 years ago, a very prominent person from the US. And the reason why it's 15 years ago and I can remember it, because we were coming up to the 25th anniversary of November 1984. And there was a very prominent Sikh lawyer in Delhi who's dedicated his life to document, what happened to Sikhs in Delhi and other things. I took him along, met this person from America who's UK based. He's now in the US. And he said, if you give me this, I'll take it to the US State Department and we will put, not the Congress, but we'll put India in the dock. And that was 15 years ago. And I saw the reaction of that lawyer thinking, because he said all the strings are pulled from the US. The day the US tells Britain what to do, that's when you'll see Britain. And I think this is the interesting about Keir Starmer. He's been very much aligned with America. So he's been thinking about the future, obviously Joe Biden. And so it'd be interesting to see which way, if Donald Trump comes into power, this could go either way with Donald Trump. Anything could happen with Donald Trump. He could be quite aggressive with India. And I think all the agencies and the administration, the people behind government in the US, are convinced that the current India regime, with Modi its head, albeit a slightly weaker regime, is just not good for the US, or actually across the globe, because some of that element, and we do talk about Hindutva, and I think it's important, there's a whole section about that, is I think that is the big challenge across the globe, because there are now so many, issues happening in the US, in Canada, in the UK, Australia, and more of that's coming out. And I think agencies in particular need to get to grips with it. And I think they're saying, but it's all being exported from India and that current thing. And it's not the fault of the people coming here as students or on work visas, but they're coming with like a brainwashed mentality that Modi's a god, because that's the way he's almost like portraying himself. And I think that's really, I was thinking the other day about, how did Hitler die? Supposedly committed suicide, shot himself. How did Mussolini die? It was a firing squad. And I was trying to actually compare it with Indira Gandhi, given the way she died, is actually when you get leaders, and Modi and the RSS and everything they believe with that right-wing extremism, that Hitler to them is, someone who's very positive, and, that whole philosophy. I think there should be almost any world leader that genuinely believes in making the world a better place should have a big question mark over India as it is now and what the future holds. And I think there's an opportunity. Sikhs will play their part wherever they are in the globe. And we talk to Sikhs throughout the globe. And we're trying to say, let's raise it to the next level. But ultimately, it will be about governments and politicians. But the one thing I always say is, look, we can never compete with governments. We don't have the resources. But we have one thing, and it's one very simple word, and it's throughout our faith, which is the truth. The truth will ultimately prevail. And therefore, that Sikh homeland, I hope to see it in my lifetime being re-established. And I think we're just a lot closer than we think.
Yeah, I think that's a very pertinent and powerful point to finish on. Dabinderjit Singh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Angus. Always a pleasure.
And thank you for watching the Satluj TV podcast. We'll see you next time.